Welcome, everybody, and welcome to listeners on Aspen Public Radio. This is our final McCloskey Speaker Series, and I'm deeply proud. We've had a very good summer, and I think it's a haven here in Aspen where we've had civil dialogue, which is sometimes missing in other zip codes in this nation. But we've, between the Republican governors and Democratic governors and the Security Forum, we've been able to hear a diverse range of opinions, and I want to thank you all. This is really my last public meeting here in Aspen. I want to thank you all because everybody here has been so civil, so engaged, and so interested in hearing the various things we are doing. Today, we're very honored to have Thomas Barrack with us. I've known him for a while, off and on. I think I first met him at a very good dinner. But I've had the past hour with him, and it's been absolutely fascinating. I didn't know his background, but also his deep interest in the Americas and other things which Jimmy will get into. But it made me feel a lot better about our country and also some of the things you may be doing in the future. Prominent financier in Southern California, but if I may say, from a family that went back and forth from one of my favorite cities, Beirut, Lebanon, which is your heritage. He was a senior official in the Reagan administration. He was a senior advisor to Donald Trump during the 2016 campaign. Chaired the Inaugural Committee, has been a confidant and a friend, and he's agreed to help us understand better an administration that sometimes is sending mixed signals. So he's going to send some clear signals. I've asked Jimmy Reese. Everybody knows Jimmy. He's a man who needs no introduction, but I've known him so long, I know he likes an introduction. So I'm going to say of him, I grew up in New Orleans with him in Pixie, and Jimmy is one of those people who has strong opinions, but also an open mind. He's been a great civic leader and a great business leader in our city, meaning New Orleans, but also in the city of Aspen. So I'm going to turn it over to both of you, and I thank all of you all for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Walter. Are we on here? Good. Well, we have some breaking news, Tom. I got an email in the middle of the night last night about some new possible post or position for yourself in the administration. Can we talk about that for a minute?
Well, if it's not a tweet, I wouldn't believe it.
Actually, it was an email, the slow kind. It wasn't tweeted. So it maybe have come from a different source, so you never know. Can we talk about this in Mexico?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to talk about Mexico in general. I'd prefer not to talk about that,
okay.
the possibility of that position. I'm always happy to do whatever would be great for
well,
the
then let me dance around this for a minute. It appears to me that somebody has asked you to be more involved in our relationship with Mexico than you have been or are now. And before we came in here to the auditorium, we were having a discussion with Walter and Pixie about Mexico is not just being a part of NAFTA and its relationship with the United States, but Mexico as being either a linchpin or a key to all of South America as a trading partner and as an economic partner and possibly a political partner for all of us. Is that how you see this?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me give you my view from the cheap seats, which is not the administration's view, which is just an individual's view that has some economic ties. First of all, the machinery in place is, Rex Tillerson is one of the most capable human beings ever that we could have as Secretary of State. And Mexico as an entity, put aside the rhetoric in the campaign, is probably the most important relationship that the United States has in its perspective at the moment. So, I mean, just a few facts, and we've all heard about the wall and the immigration issues, which have been a great moment for the last year. But the real issue in Mexico is trade. So if you look at the U.S. as 5,000 kilometers of border $1.5 billion in trade goes across that border every day. So the yearly trade in Mexico is much greater than the exporting of U.S. goods to China. So if you think about Mexico and Latin America in general, if you said, let's make the Americas great again, if you took Canada and Mexico combined, added that Argentina, Peru, Colombia, Venezuela, and Brazil, you have more trade across those two boundaries than you do in all of Asia. So a way to think about Mexico, rather than a wall, is if you expedited infrastructure, if you expedited the flow of goods, however you get there, you solidify your boundaries, you block China. The biggest investor through Mexico and South America at the moment is China. So what's happening in Mexico at the moment is you have a candidate, Lopez Obrador, who's a Venezuelan-type candidate, who's moving into position in Mexico for the elections a year from now, that if that came to fruition would be a really, really bad thing for America. So as the administration and the president and secretary of state look across the realm of all the issues that they have to deal with, which are immense, Korea, Russia being at the top of the heap, really, Mexico and all of Latin America is essential to send a united message. If you had one belt, one road through Mexico to Latin America, you would solve all the problems. And trade is the answer to drugs. You have General Kelly, who has immense experience in Mexico and
yes, he was head of the Southern Command.
And he's first class. He has command and control. He understands that situation. And the way to solve that problem is by helping Mexico and Latin America become greater. We've never had a united Latin America because it's all been multilateral negotiations. So I think the focus on Mexico from trade and economic power, the focus on then Latin America, starting with Argentina. Macri is a very good friend of the president's. He's done a great job in Argentina. PPK in Peru is actually an American. He went to Princeton. He's an amazing human being. Santos in Colombia has done a great job. It's a moment. So if you looked at it and said, in a way to solve part of the world problems in a protectionist environment, let's concentrate on what's right under our fingers. And forget about political rhetoric for a minute. If you want to create jobs and you want trade, you just go to both borders. Between Canada and Mexico, you have the largest trading regime in the world. And that's kind of the theory.
Yes, and if we're not careful in expanding ourselves beyond this three-country arrangement that we have, we're going to find somebody else coming from someplace else across the Pacific Ocean taking our position in those countries south of Mexico.
Absolutely. It would be a bad thing to have China building a port in Tijuana and San Diego.
Yes.
But it can happen.
Yes, it can. So let's move on to something else that I think probably 99.9% of the people in this room would want to hear something about in your relationship with President Trump. Did you advise or counsel President Trump before he decided to do this? It might have been just a figment of his imagination, or maybe you were having a drink with him one night, or kicking some ideas around about what do we do next with real estate or whatever. And I mean, how did this happen?
First of all of you know, no matter what political persuasion you have, nobody advises President Trump. Right? President Trump advises you. And by the way, every time I go to him with some brilliant scheme, right, because I'm much more moderate than he is, he explains to me that if he would have listened to me, he would still be on The Apprentice. He'd no longer be president of the United States. And he's absolutely right. So, I mean, it's amazing. And just, you know, my view as a person, right, just as an individual who knows him. First of all, he's much better than his billing. So those of you who are skeptical of him, or those of you who look at his conduct and his actions and find it abhorrent, it may be abhorrent, but there's a reason and a rationale he is a very driven human being. So I've known him for 40 years. We started, at one point in life, had the great opportunity of working for the Basses in Fort Worth, Texas, and we had bought the Westin Hotel Company, and the Westin Hotel Company owned the Plaza Hotel in New York.
Right.
And we were both, I think, 30 or 31 at the time, and I was working for Bob Bass, and he was already a big-time real estate person, but not as big as he was. And that started our relationship. But to give you an example of how he is managing today, I'll give you an example of how my relationship started with him then, because I think it's a great example of how he manages by confusion and chaos, but there's a reason for it. So we were selling this hotel. It was part of a 60 hotel package, but it was the most highly sought asset in the entire program. We were going for an auction, and I'm working for Bob Bass, so my main concern was not to get fired, right? It wasn't to get rich. So he called me up. I knew him because we had sold him an interest in Alexander's department store. So he called me up one day and he says, look, I want to buy the hotel. I said, Donald, I know you want to buy the hotel, but it takes money and commitment, and I know you have neither. He said, no, that's not true. I'm telling you I'm going to do it. Just come over, spend 15 minutes with me. I said, I'm not going to spend 15 minutes with you because, you're like the scorpion. You're going to entice me across the stream, and you're going to make me do something, and I'm going to get fired. He said, no, I promise. I'm going to make you a hero. So I go and I sit in his office, and his office at the time is overlooking the plaza, and it's gold everywhere, and it's the antithesis of Bob Bass, right, who's very conservative. So Donald sits down and he says, look, I want to buy the hotel. What's the number? I said, well, Mr. Bass wants X number, and that's what the number is. He said, okay, I'll pay it, and I'll do it in 10 days. I said, but here's the condition. There are no contingencies. He said, no contingencies. I said, no, there can't be any contingencies because I know you, Donald Trump, will find 1,000 things wrong with it, and by the time we're done, we'll go back and negotiate this purchase price, and I'll end up with jujubes in my hand at the end of the day, right? He says, no, that's not going to happen. I said, well, how is it not going to happen? He says, okay, here's the deal. You tell me everything that's wrong with the property and everything that I need to do, and I'll close the deal in 10 days. I said, I just told you there can't be any contingencies. He said, no, I'm not talking about legally. You, Tom Barrack, just shake my hand and you tell me verbally now what it is, and I will live to that commitment. I said, are you out of your mind? You want me to just tell you, and you're not going to sue me when something goes wrong? He said, no, I'm telling you, man to man, this is what we'll do. It was the most brilliant thing that I've ever seen because he had me so obligated, right? He played a card of judging me. At that time in my life, he knew I needed to make the deal. He made a judgment that I would do what I said. So the long and the short of it is, it took me 5 months. He closed exactly what he said, but I solved every problem for him that was in the deal. And there was a little lady, one of the biggest things was this holdover tenant. And her name was Fanny. So he said, okay, I'm going to take everything, but you deal with Fanny. And if you didn't get Fanny out of this building, by the way, you couldn't convert it to a condo. So I said, that's all you want me to do? Fanny was the smartest woman ever. She drove me nuts. But this is Donald Trump. He made a decision in 5 minutes. It was a brilliant decision. He got everything right. But so it's like having 10 cappuccinos. And all the rest of us are saying, okay, you want to evaluate the espresso? I want a chemical test of the espresso. He looks at you and he says, I know Jimmy. Jimmy from New Orleans knows espresso. So I'm looking at him with the cup and see the foam. And I'm looking at Jimmy's reaction to how he's looking at everybody else's espresso. So he never goes to the espresso. He looks and he says, I believe in Jimmy. Jimmy knows the espresso. I'm going with him. And that's what he does with the generals, and that's what he does with people. And he curates by chaos and controversy. And by the way, when you walk into his office, nothing has changed. When I walked into this office with him the first time, there's 10 people in the room. I don't know who the other 9 people are. But I'm having this conversation with him. In the meantime, the phone rings. It's somebody from the New York Times. He puts them on the phone and says, what do you think about Tom's deal? I'm going, what? What's happening? People are voting thumbs up, thumbs down. They like this term, they didn't like that term. Right? It's very unusual. That's what's happened in the White House. So in the White House up until now, For those of you who haven't been, the White House is legendary and amazing, and the power that exists within it is phenomenal, but the place itself is not luxurious. So all of these amazing people that come to work there who are sacrificing by being there in very tight quarters, but they come in and out of his door like popcorn because that's what he loves. He makes decisions based on the people who are bringing him things. So in all of these things, when he came into power and he didn't know how to govern, I think an interesting way to look at it, and by the way, I'm a moderate, so I look at all of this and have such unbelievable admiration for him just as a warrior, stepping into the arena and saying, look, what I'm going to do for all of you, Democrats, Independents, and Republicans, is I'm going to challenge the system. And a lot of us are not going to like the process along that road, because challenging entitlement and an establishment in any system is aggravating, and there's no right answer, right? There's no right answer to 650,000 employees. There's no right answer when the federal budget is 90% entitlements. There's no right answer when to change the cheeseburger inside the White House mess, you need 535 individuals to approve it in Congress, right? It's a constituency, and to get these constituencies to agree to anything is quite complicated. So his view of it was, I don't need anything. I, Donald Trump, have more power as an individual than I had as President of the United States. I had more money that I'm making for myself than I did as President of the United States. I already had fame. I had 13 years on The Apprentice. I had more followers than any presidential candidate in history. So all I want to do is chip away at this system. So when we measure what's happening, and you listen to people, you listen to Trump forever, people say, well, here's the things we've accomplished in the first 200 days. And then you listen to the other side, say you haven't accomplished anything in the first 200 days. We don't have Obamacare. We don't have a tax bill. Foreign policy in disarray. You've been through 2 chiefs of staff. You have a different communications director, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, all those things have happened in almost every administration. You've never seen a harder working man than this. He's in that White House by himself. His family's someplace else. He doesn't drink. He doesn't smoke. He has no hobbies. It's golf, right? And he's 1,000% focused in taking abuse. So when you think about it, the only other way of doing this is to make everybody happy. So would we all be happy if we had a consensus president? We still wouldn't, right? President Obama, we all wanted him to be successful. We were all hoping he'd be successful. It was the American dream, right? To have this intelligent, charming black man be the representative of America is what we all hoped, and he did the best job that he could. But it's not possible to make 300 million people happy. So this president is just chipping away at the establishment, and the establishment is pushing back. There's no right answer. In my opinion, the good thing is we're all talking about it, and we're all agitated. One way or the other, we're all agitated. And the world is becoming agitated. But look what happened. Amazingly, through chaos, through keeping the world off balance, you had a president who had come out totally against Islam. As a matter of fact, had put border controls against Islam, who then convenes in Riyadh the first ever 58-country meeting of Islamic countries that coordinates an attempt for good Islam to intervene with bad Islam. Never before had that been done. And he turned it on a dime. But he turned it on a dime from saying Islam is bad. Mexico, we're talking about the same thing. The rhetoric on Mexico was hyperbole. And we all know Mexico is so important to all of us. And we have family and friends that are Mexicans, and Mexicans are amongst the hardest working, well-intended people. And even on drug control, it's them themselves that are controlling that southern border from Central America, which is feeding all the drugs. And by the way, it's our kids that are using the drugs. So at some point in time, we've got to wake up. But the hyperbole that's going on creates a different kind of dialogue. And what is that dialogue? That dialogue is bilateral. So I've witnessed myself from these very harsh positions, the heads of countries talking to him on a one-on-one basis in a way that's never been done before. So what happens with that is diplomacy becomes frustrated.
When you say that they're talking with President Trump in a way that's never been done before, is this because it's more personal, it's more private, it's in a group of people? What do you mean by that?
So let me give you an example. In normal political parlance, the president would never talk to the head of a country without first formally going through the Secretary of State. And the Secretary of State would have a whole process of his 75 designees, his 75 most senior political appointments, that would then give a white paper, a briefing paper, on what the proper protocol for that conversation to take place would be, which would be starting at a deputy assistant secretary, going to the assistant secretary, then going to the undersecretary, then going to the deputy secretary.
I'm already asleep.
Right? And so would he be. So what does the president do? He says, call the prime minister. So what happens is shockwaves go through the State Department, literally shockwaves, and he picks up the phone and he has a conversation. But, I mean, President Xi, China, just think about this for a minute. It had never happened before. Here you have the two most powerful countries at Mar-a-Lago. So President Xi is sitting here at Mar-a-Lago thinking, what's going on? They're having a beautiful dinner. In between steak and chocolate cake, General McMaster comes over and tells the president, we're locked and loaded. President Xi understands a little bit of English, and he's saying, locked and loaded? I thought we were having chocolate cake, right? The president turns around to McMaster's and says, I want to talk to the captain of the destroyer. He says, well, Mr. President, you've talked to the commander of the fleet. He says, no, I want to talk to the captain of the destroyer that's firing the first missiles. He steps out for 2 minutes. He talks to the captain. He said, what are the odds of making a mistake? Captain tells him there are no odds. By the way, these new warriors are like our kids. They're video game kings, right? The computers are running everything.
Right.
They put 58 ballistic missiles through the front door of a garage without affecting any ancillary damage. But President Xi is sitting here while they're having this conversation, so he comes back and chocolate cake is just being served. So he says, okay, release the missiles. 22 minutes. The president says, I better tell him what's happening before he finishes the chocolate cake. So he leans over and says, President Xi, I think I need to tell you, I've just released 58 ballistic missiles that are going to go through the front door. And President Xi is sitting here taking a bite. And he looks at his interpreter and he says, repeat. Can you imagine this moment? I mean, mind-boggling, right? But it created a bond. Even what you see in Korea is you never had the United Nations of China and Russia agreeing to the sanctions on North Korea. And it really developed, in my humble opinion, as a result of the president's personal relationship with both Putin and Xi, that he bypassed this political correctness, which is good and bad.
Do you think you characterized his activity as president as chipping away at the bureaucracy, but do you think this is part of that chipping away? His saying, look, I don't need to go through 13 or 15 or 1,000 levels of bureaucracy in order to get to the person I want to talk to. I just call him up on the phone.
I think that is the portrayal, and underneath it there's a machine that's taking care of all the bureaucracy. So it's not as ad hoc as it appears. So when the president makes a comment, there's machinery that's going on behind it that's very thoughtful and careful, and it's not abrupt. But what he's trying to do is act abrupt. So North Korea, which is way beyond my pay grade, or any of our pay grade.
Mine too.
Right? To understand, you have to assume that nobody is so reckless to engage in this kind of discussion without the entire military establishment telling him this is the correct thing to do. And whatever we've done in the past 8 years hasn't worked. Right? We have this absurd individual who keeps insulting us and insulting us. And so now we're trying a different kind of presidential diplomacy. But again, it's this, one of the powers which frustrates us all is not knowing how he's going to act is a power if underneath it there's really a rhyme and a reason to how he's acting. So regardless of what the political position is on all these issues, which is very difficult to ascertain, right? I mean, I can tell you from personal experience, and we were talking about it before, in the White House, there's no meter of efficacy. They're all drinking from fire hoses, and they're all working 20 hours a day. But unlike all of us that have a beginning and a middle and an end to something that we're doing, in the White House, there's no beginning and a middle and an end. There's no process, right? So you can't say, did I do a good job today or a bad job today or an in-between job? It just continues on. And this building of a constituency between the 535 individuals, senators and congressmen, who are all great people, all trying to do the right thing. But when we talk about trade, poor Wilbur Ross, by the way, you have the best cabinet, and again, in my humble opinion, in history. Steve Mnuchin, Wilbur Ross, Mattis, Tillerson, Gary Cohn, Dina Powell, Rick Perry. These are first grade individuals, right? So what happens on trade, for instance? How do you get a trade decision done when you have the USTR that has to go back to Congress for approval? So some congressman represents a district that makes this glass. All that congressman cares about is the productivity of the constituency who makes this glass. Right. So when they go to get approval for any trade deal, to get 535 individuals who are representing thousands and thousands of constituencies is unbelievably complicated, right? It's not, are we at a balance or are we at a deficit? So the process of governing is so complex that as we're sitting and voting with our feet, right? So popularity, and this president's popularity is at the lowest in history. I can tell you, in his mind, that's not the metric by which he's judging. He's saying, I was sent here to be unpopular. I was sent here to chip away and test this system. Not necessarily to get rid of Obamacare, not necessarily to replace it with something better, not necessarily to get a tax cut bill of the efficacy of what he said, but to keep pushing that system, testing that system, keeping all of us engaged, which he's done, right? We're all engaged. No matter how you feel, you're engaged.
Positive and negatively,
Absolutely.
You're engaged. Let's talk for a second about his relationship with Congress, because it's such an integral part of his ability to govern. You know, he can chip away and chip away and chip away, but unless he gets a majority of the people on both sides, in both houses, to agree to do something, tax reform, revision of health care, you name it, nothing really happens. So what is his relationship with the Democratic minority, with the Democratic leaders, with Nancy Pelosi and that group? Does he talk with these people? Does he
Sure.
interface with them in some way and try to negotiate in some way?
He does, and he does on an individual basis, but and even with his own party, right? I mean, we've seen with Mitch McConnell, who's a fantastic, unbelievable individual, whose wife, by the way, is the Secretary of Transportation. So when you look at are they at odds with each other? They're not at odds with each other, and in my opinion, the president, in building constituencies in Congress, is utilizing the same tools as he did in negotiating business deals in the past, which is a bit of harshness and exaggeration, which ends up coming back to normalcy. Now, I think everybody's learning that the expectations of greatness are less than we hoped for, and the expectations of despair and defeat are better than we hoped for. But everybody is, in midterms, is coming to closure and saying, we better get together and find the common denominator, which is very difficult for the efficacy of all of us, on things that matter. So Obamacare, if we were sitting and probably creating a menu for the president, you probably wouldn't have started with health care, right? Health care being the most difficult. Sure. I think you're going to see a tax bill. Mnuchin and Cohen and the president have done a great job, and I think Congress will embrace a tax bill that will be satisfactory to everybody, probably not as great as people hoped. And the president, quite honestly, I think, is learning to govern better by understanding that these constituencies need to be built, and without selling out his base, right? The problem always is, if you look at the base, and I'm assuming on both coasts you have investors and intellectuals, and in the middle of the country, so investors mostly, who have been the beneficiaries since 2007 of this meteoric stock market. And by the way, the president can't take all the credit for the stock market, right? I mean, correlation and causation are two different things. This has been going on for a long time. But it's been phenomenal. But the beneficiaries of that have been primarily investors. The working people haven't had an increase in wages for 10 years.
Or longer.
Right? So this is a real problem. So when people have to use an emergency room for health care, and you can't send your child for public education, and there's no increase in wages, and jobs are being lost, this is a significant problem. So he looks at his base and says, this is my base. If I create too many constituencies in Congress, I'm going to lose my base because they think I became one of them because I sold out. So you have half of the staff in the White House saying, yes, Mr. President, we understand that, and you need to start bending in this direction because we have to make deals to get things done. And you have other staffers in the White House saying you have to be loyal to your base because you were sent here for a mission to not sell out and become part of this political rhetoric. So I think the answer is, I'm hopeful, honestly, that out of this very flamboyant dialogue, and with the disillusionment that people have in the president, that issues that we would have not thought of or discussed will come to bear even on our congressmen and senators, who are all well-meaning people. And you know, when people say Congress is idiotic, it's not. These are such hardworking people for nothing in a fishbowl that's so complicated. So if you think of the process of governing, I mean, I'll give you a great example. President Reagan, who was one of the greatest human beings everywhere, and not totally dissimilar from President Trump, right? They have a lot of similarities in their background.
You might get a little pushback on that comment.
Well, no. They both, by the way, no one ever thought an actor could become president of the United States. No one ever thought a real estate finance person could become president of the United States. No one ever thought a man from Eureka College could become president of the United States. Nobody ever thought a divorced person could become president of the United States. And when the President Reagan came into effect, he went through his national security advisor and a chief of staff in the first 5 months. But a cute story about President Reagan is he had a ranch called Tip Top Ranch. And he loved it and Nancy hated it because it was a crummy old ranch up on top of the Santa Ynez Mountains, and he had a cook there named Lupe. So I used to come home every weekend and say, Lupe, one day you and I are going to the White House. And when I go to the White House, Lupe, you're coming with me. Yes, Mr. President, this would be amazing. We're ready to go to the White House. And the president was that kind of guy. You know, when he said it, he meant it. So it's January 18th, 1980. He shows up at the White House. By January 21st, he goes to Mike Deaver, and he says, by the way, where's Lupe? He says, Mr. President, Lupe is not here. He said, well, fine, we'll get him here, because we need him here this week. He said, Mr. President, we have a slight problem. He said, what's the slight problem? He says, well, Lupe can't be the chef in the White House mess. He says, well, what do you mean he can't be the chef? He says, well, the White House mess is run by the Navy, and the Navy is run by the Department of Defense. And the Department of Defense requires that you be a GS-12, and of course the president's just glazing over. He says, fine, just do it. He said, but Mr. President, I can't do it. So the president says, well, wait a second, I can declare war on the world. I can tear down the Berlin Wall, and I can't get friggin' Lupe here as a chef? He says, you can't. So the president actually built a kitchen in the residence so he could put Lupe in instead of the White House mess. But this is government, right? I mean, this is really the process. So what they're fighting is not because any of these people are ill-willed or the controversy between Bannon and Priebus and Jared, and everybody is trying to do a great job. But the process of governing is so complex that the bureaucracy, in a way, saves the day. So, to give you an example, presidential appointments, there's 2,990 presidential appointments. So when a president comes in,
2,990.
2,990. So the rest of the civil servants stay in place, but those, the lieutenants who are directing policy, are all appointed by the president. Out of those 2,990 spots, there's only 50 that have been nominated. So it's like Tom Brady, right? Are there any Patriot fans? Right, it's like Tom Brady sitting here with a center and saying, okay, guys, where's my wide receiver? Where's my fullback? Give me the ball. But there's nobody to throw the ball to. There's nobody in place. Why is there nobody in place? 3 reasons. Number one, this president had no reservoir of resources. So unlike great presidents before him, President Obama, President Clinton, President Bush, could recruit from previous Democratic or Republican administrations of people who had experience in governing. So if you wanted a Secretary of State, you could go back and recruit somebody who was an Undersecretary of State or an Assistant Secretary of State or somebody who was in the Department of Defense. And those people had been through government, had been through the clearance process, the OGE process, et cetera. Of course, with President Trump, when he says, I want only forever Trumpers, I said, yes, Mr. President, but there were only 3, your daughter and 2 sons. Right? I mean, he started from a very low base. So to find people that have experience, to find people who are there politically, and then at the category of the regime that he's using, of people who have had business experience elsewhere, the financial sacrifice that's necessary to get through the boundaries of clearance and senatorial confirmation is immense. Now you add to that a democratic process that's saying the way to frustrate and encourage this president to deal is to not give him any more of his appointments. Now, the strategy is a sound one, but not a good one, because what happens is then all the decisions just happen out of the White House anyhow. So in a little while, the team will start being in place. Congress will come together because the midterm elections are going to force them to come together. The voices of all of you will be sounded loudly on all of these issues, on the difficult issues and the easy issues. And the process of governing will continue. And we have a different warrior sounding a different drum. And I think we have to judge him differently. So it's not really by popularity. Is he making the visualization for us of the complexity of this government and the issues that we're dealing with any more vibrant for us to examine? And if that's so, then we have to take responsibility ourselves for what's happening. But it's quite complicated.
Yeah, it's more than complicated. And I think that in this age of instant gratification, instant messaging, instant everything, all of us want to see something happen instantly now. And I'm glad you described the layers that one has to go through in order to reach a decision, other than just getting frustrated and having build Lupe a kitchen for himself, which I think is a terrific analogy. But speaking about the instant messaging and the reaching out to people with an instant idea or a thought, let's talk for a second about tweeting. And it's surprising to me that he would do this, because I think sometimes he undercuts himself in some of the work that he's trying to do. Can you give us, since you have such a close relationship with, any insight as to why he does this, and is there some rationale for this for himself?
Yes, and look, I think so many people around him feel the same way that you do, and one of them including me.
It's puzzling.
Well, and again, his response to me is the response that I gave you. Had he listened to my advice, he would be with Mark Burnett on the 14th season of The Apprentice. He bypassed everything, right? So his view, in his mind, honestly, the institutional press is selling themselves by creating negative news and information. Now, he doesn't help that, right? Because he's not reaching out to that constituency saying, let me participate and educate you more or better or in a non-adversarial way, because it's the same method and madness that he's using on everything, is saying, look, I am going to be who I am. I'm going to say things that every American would like to say about the press, and I can do what our 18-year-old kids do in bypassing institutional media by going to Twitter and having 35 million people instantly, which retweet to another 160 million people instantly with my point of view. So I'm not going to have it distilled by CNN or Fox or Breitbart or any of the institutional delivery systems. So what happens is we're all used to having it filtered. But think of, I mean, Walter Cronkite, all of you are too young to remember Walter Cronkite. But, right, many of us used to watch Walter Cronkite, and he had such unbelievable reputational capital that he kind of filtered the facts for us, but without too much of a perspective one way or the other. They would just lay out the facts and you would make your own independent decision. But today it's like everything else. Actually, we get more information on our cell phone than the CIA gets in an instant. So the CIA can have the NSC with satellites in the sky giving it information, but we'll have the same information in an instant on our phone. So he's adapted the same philosophy of saying his mechanism in dealing with the American public, for better or worse, for well thought or not well thought, whatever they think, right? For the outlandishness of what might be on a tweet, for the taking on of an individual, right? Even the personal interactions.
Personal interaction, yeah.
Which many of us feel is harsh, right? Which is non-presidential. You don't, as a president, you don't need to take that on. Is purposeful in his mind, because he's saying what I'm doing is I'm delivering what every individual in their own mind would like to do themselves, and by doing that, I'm chipping away at the institutional press, just like I'm chipping away at the institutional bureaucracy. Now, right or wrong, I tell him, you know who the happiest person about tweeting is Jeff Zucker, the head of CNN. Right? CNN would be gone if it weren't for the president. Right? I mean, the president is the greatest stimulus for Jeff Zucker. And by the way, they were friends. So everybody says that Fox News is the president's greatest friends. By the way, the amount of viewers is tiny compared to social media. Cable TV, you take all of cable TV, you take 4 or 5 million viewers, and then you retweet that to maybe 14 or 15 million. He tweets directly to 36 million people in a nanosecond. So we're all learning the power of disintermediation, the Uberization of everything. Amazon, right? I come home, I have 2 tiny kids. My garage looks like an Amazon.com logistics center. Right? The boxes are just piled to the ceiling. But everything is being disintermediated, and what we're experiencing is the disintermediation of a government, which feels very uncomfortable because we're used to a cadence and a calibration that has pace and has what we thought was thoughtful consideration. But the reality is the thoughtful consideration hasn't worked. Look at the situation we're in the world. Look at the wars that we've been in. Look at the budget. Look at the deficits. Look at taxation. Look at the intervention of the economic markets, right? Today, we're all the beneficiaries since 2007 of a buoyant market. Why? Because we're printing money. Before 2007, nobody could name who the head of a central bank was. There's a bunch of academics that came out of financial institutions that were sitting in the back room calculating money flows that nobody cared about. Today, they're buying $60 billion a month in assets and printing money. So what happens? Everybody needs a house in Aspen. Why do they need a house in Aspen? Because it's 0 interest rates. Zero interest rates, negative interest rates, the long bond in Germany. When you think about it, how could you have a 10-year bond at negative interest rates? In Switzerland, the banks are actually paying homeowners for the mortgages. This is the world that we live in. So we're all sitting and saying, well, assets seem pretty expensive, right? Nothing seems cheap. Wages haven't increased. It's the disintermediation of everything. Retail stores are going broke. Shopping centers are going by the wayside. Increasing coal pipelines. How many of you are in the coal business? Is there anybody here that's going to have a better job from a coal slurry pipeline? Not going to happen, right? So all of these issues take a stark look by all of us. Forget about the president. The president is just a mirror that's shaking us into trauma, one way or the other. And he's a visionary. I can tell you honestly, he is on target. He feels he's doing 100% the right job. When I talk to him sometime in the evenings, and I'm a little depressed by something that had happened, he's not. And he looks at this ability for all of us to sit here and have these conversations with each other. Some saying, I like what he's doing. Many saying, I don't like what he's doing. Some talking about healthcare, some talking about tax policy, some talking about Korea, some talking about Mexico, some talking about Islam, some talking about healthcare, housing policy, all of these things. The rhetoric is so vibrant. So out of this, something good will happen. Something good, because you have a warrior who really has a different agenda than political correctness. And we can be upset with it, but you can fix it. Or you can look at it and say the responsibility ultimately is coming to us to make some other kind of decision.
You know, in preparation for this conversation this afternoon, I was going through some of David McCullough's works. And he wrote a piece about Harry Truman when Truman was first in the White House, and he was totally exasperated with the way things are going, which sounds like President Trump, right? I mean, he just bypasses everything. So I was going to ask you this as a question, but I think you've already answered it. Because Trump is not like, I don't think he's like this. Truman said, aside from the impossible administrative burden, the president has to take all sorts of abuse from liars and demagogues. The people can never understand why the president does not use his supposedly great power to make them behave. Well, all the president is a glorified public relations man who spends his time flattering, kissing, and kicking people to get them to do what they're supposed to do anyway. So when I read this, I thought, well, maybe I ought to ask Tom about this. But then I think you've already answered the question about the fact that he just bypasses everything and says, this is what we're going to do, and let's do it. And if somebody doesn't like it, I'll tell the world about it.
Yeah, and the amount of abuse that he takes on our behalf, when you think about it really, right, what is the incentive for him to endure abuse? It's not for political gain. It's not for power. It's not for money. It's not for prestige.
It's not for money because he gives his salary away every quarter.
Well, and he had all that, right? So in his own mind, where he's going is the right direction. And it's always, the degree of efficacy is always inversely proportionate to the path that people want to go. In my own life, you know, people say, for whatever tiny modicum of success that I have, they say, what was the secret? I said, I showed up where nobody wanted to go, including with the president, right? I mean, starting in life, I mean, I was a lawyer. I went to work for a great firm, but my first lucky break was they needed a finance lawyer to go to Saudi Arabia in 1972. I was one in 160 million people that would do that. Who's sane is going to go to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia in 1972? Right?
Tom Barrack.
And well, but you know, on and on and on. So that path that nobody has been on is lonely. It's daunting. You're never deafened by the applause of going down that road at the time. But at least we have somebody who's willing to do it. I'm telling you, I could never succumb to the daily abuse that all of these people take. Look at all of them. I mean, now what's happening, and Bob Mueller is a great guy, you know, another topic on the special prosecutor, but he's a first-class professional. He's hired 50 first-class professionals. They're doing what they need to do. But inside the White House, now everybody's being subpoenaed. So you have 27-year-old kids who are working for $55,000 a year, who are working 24/7, who are now going to have legal bills of $160,000 going through every email or text that they've ever received. So the whole focus stops from being governing to saying, whoa, what's happening here? And who's the team? And where's the team? And what happens? So the process of something that looks logical, right? When we say, okay, all of the perception of Russian interference, however you think about it, my personal view on all this is at the end of the day, there'll be no connection to this president and the interference of Russia in the election. That being said, everything else in the perimeter of what now is being looked at is problematic because everybody freaks out, saying, my God, I've got 60 of the best special prosecutors who have open season and looking at every aspect of everything that's happened. So what happens is the spirit and the camaraderie of driving forward with an agenda changes focus to all of these things that are necessary and important but not fruitful for us. Because at the end of the day, none of that is going to do us any good. But the president being abhorrent to that creates another perception, right? So people saying, well, the president's going to fire the special prosecutor. And we all go, that can't happen, right? It appears that it would look horrible or that it would look rash or just let it go on. Form a data room, get it over with, and move on. But in the president's mind, he's saying, I know I, the president, had nothing to do with this, so it's outlandish. And I can't be about the business that I have while all this is going on because I have 2 congressional committees, I have 60 special prosecutors, I have everybody who's on staff going crazy, I have poor Sessions who did the right thing and recusing himself, who's now in the box, right? It's chaos. It's unintended consequences from all of the circumference of all of these unintended circles that probably at the end of the day don't relate to anything. But we've detracted ourselves from command and control of saying, here's an agenda, here's what I need to do to the American people. The only thing that anybody cares about at the end of the day for the majority of people is how much more money a month the average person can put in their pocket. Can they educate their kids? Do they have a health system? And are we safe in our country? If he did those things, regardless of how we feel about him or how brash he is or how abrasive he is or how arrogant he may be at times, everybody would applaud. And if he doesn't do those things, whatever he's done has been a waste. But that's what we need to get down to.
Yeah. Let's talk about something else on a larger scale. I think you're absolutely correct in that analysis. When we were in Walter's office before we came into Petke's auditorium this afternoon, we talked about your tenure in the Middle East and your perception of historically why the West, the United States, Great Britain, other European countries were in the Middle East to start off with, back as much as 120 to 200 years ago. And the structure that we have created that is now coming back to bite us in the backside is the nicest way I can put it. And do you think, given your friendship with and your relationship with the president, that he understands the historical aspects of our involvement in other countries, particularly at this point in time in the Middle East? Or is he looking at the whole thing sort of as a business problem, as if he was at Harvard and graduate business school trying to figure out a problem that had everything it had to deal with it, economics and everything else along with that?
It's a great question, and I'm going to give you my view, but this is just my view. This is not the administration's view. This is Tom Barrack, a Lebanese Catholic American's view, right? As an Arab American immigrant. So the president gets it. He gets the historic value, but let's talk about what that is. So, and there's a great book for any of you who are really interested. Elizabeth Macmillan in Paris, 1919. describes what is the Middle East, which didn't exist, by the way. Right? Before 1919, you had hundreds of tribes and flags that had a historical context that didn't agree on anything. They didn't agree on religion, they didn't agree on geography, they didn't agree on language. And we, the Western powers, at World War I, World War II, said we need to align them differently for our benefit. So the Sykes-Picot Treaty, Sykes-Picot were a Brit and a Frenchman who sat with a map and said, we're going to divide this up, and we're going to divide it up for the benefit of Great Britain, the United States, and France. So the envisioning of the countries that we now look at as Gulf countries, or across the way, Iran, Iraq, Turkey, were all envisioned after the Marshall Plan. And what we did is said, we are resource constrained. This part of the world has the majority of fuel that we will need to have our industrial revolution for the next 30 years. So we are going to form the Seven Sisters, the 7 major oil companies, and we're going to propagate regimes who are beneficial to us so that we can take their resources. How do we do that? We need corrupt dictators. And these tribes and flags were organized by chiefs and pashas and sultans who were not princes. There was no such thing at the time, right? These were not kingdoms, these were tribes. And they went from, if you look at the Gulf, if you look at the 7 Arab Emirates, or if you look at Qatar, Qatar was a pearl farm. Qatar is the wealthiest per capita country in the world, Abu Dhabi probably being the second. So the UAE, those 7 emirates, were the feudal states, and they used to pirate the British ships as they went to India. This was the main trade and traffic that it had with Iran and India. Qatar had pearl diving. Saudi Arabia had never been colonialized and was the heart of caravans and trades that were going across its borders. And when oil was discovered, it became a curse. So many of the rulers at the time knew that if you sold out to the Western's thirst for oil and gas, you would lose your culture. So what they did at the time is they sold all those interests to Western interests. So Aramco, every oil and gas distributor in the Middle East was Western. And by the way, Western-backed regimes protected them by creating a very conservative brand of Islam. Wahhabism grew in order to shelter the common people from the knowledge of what was actually being done, of the building of these vast kingdoms on the back of oil and gas revenues in regimes that were being propagated. So we can go back to the beginning of Iran and Iraq. All of the leaders in those countries were sponsored by us, by Western emissaries, and at some point in time we stopped sponsoring them. And when we stopped sponsoring them, we replaced them with somebody else who was to our benefit. And the resources from those countries were all being utilized by the West. And the regimes were artificially supporting them. So let's stop now and say, where are we? So Saudi Arabia, 30 million people. 70% of those 30 million people work for the government at 150% of what normal salaries would be, and many of them never show up to work because there's really no work, right? The independence of these nations is in jeopardy. So as now the price of oil has readjusted and gone from $100 a barrel, and the utilization of oil has changed, and we no longer need the Middle East. So the flow of oil from the Middle East to the Western countries has stopped, and our relationship with them has stopped. So where we used to be totally invested, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Lebanon, Abu Dhabi, Dubai, Oman, Qatar. Our interest now is saying we want to stop terrorism. But how do you stop terrorism when what's happening is these regimes? Let me give you just a numeric example. If you take Egypt, 90 million people. If you take from Egypt to the Gulf, forget about Iran, you have 65 million young people coming of age to 18 in the next decade without a job. So if you say, okay, I want to stop terrorism and I want to do it militarily, I'm going to kill 500,000 boys a month, you're not going to make a dent. It isn't going to happen. You have 2 billion Muslims in the world propagating at 10% a year. It isn't going to happen, right? A military approach is not going to solve this problem. So underlying all of this, you have to have good Islam come up with a different program, which is what's happening now and the president is doing in these new regimes. The Saudi Arabian conference was dynastic. It was historic. It had never happened before in history. You had the Gulf, the GCC countries that were organized and had a consortium on an economic basis, but it was the first time all those countries got together to try and agree on a format which was to harness difficult Islam by making good Islam prominent. And you have great people like Steve Mnuchin at Treasury who are harnessing this anti-money laundering endeavor, and Mattis at Defense, and Jared Kushner who organized all this, a young 36-year-old who had the insight in trying to help Palestine and Israel. But what happened is you're reorienting the entire Middle East framework. There is no independent economy for them to survive. Young people have no hope. In Syria, you have 3 million refugees leaving Syria, going to Europe and trying to come to us because there's no replanting of them. But that's nothing compared to what's going to happen in Egypt. And we haven't even talked about Iran and Turkey. So that part of the world for us is no longer the resource curse. They can't rely on us for independent economics, and we can't rely on them to control their own regimes. So what the president has done in a brilliant way is help realign those relationships. And you see it happening with Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, what happened in this controversy of what's happening with Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. 3 fantastic regimes, all pro-US. Qatar, by the way, has been one of the most pro-US regimes. But having a tribal fight amongst the 3 of them, between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE, that's really a regional dispute. But what's happened out of it, the alignment to have a new kind of Marshall Plan in the Middle East. How do you create an environment for these 60 million kids to have an opportunity other than ISIS, other than Al-Qaeda, other than hating capitalism, other than hating us? And this is the quest. This is really the quest. So this president's first step forward, think about it. Remember the rhetoric against Islam at the beginning?
Yes.
Right? It was so harsh. It was unbelievably harsh. In an instant, he turned it on a dime and created the most significant dynastic meeting of Islamic countries ever convened, whatever happens out of it, right? And with the hope of that, Palestine and Israel, you'll end up with peace. And this realignment with Iran, we go back and forth, right? The Shias and the Sunnis. But Iran is another, right? You have 70 million Shias, one of the most sophisticated environments really anywhere in the region that has to be dealt with. And look how we deal with them. We have one regime who comes in and says, I'm going to put sanctions. By the way, we've changed the regime there 3 times ourselves. Then we have another regime come in and say, well, we didn't like those sanctions so much, so let us pay you a few $100 billion and see if we can come back to normalcy. Then we're sitting here with Saudi Arabia, who has a natural disalignment with Iran, right? I mean, these are such complex regional issues for America to deal with. But what's happened is we're making gains because there's never been a direct dialogue. So in the Arab world at the moment, you have a group of young leaders. In Qatar, you have a young emir, he's 35, Tamim. Now in Saudi Arabia, you have Mohammed bin Salman. In the UAE, you have Mohammed bin Zayed. You have a new breed of Arab leader who's looking for something other than the repatriation of oil revenues to build their societies, and it's up to us to give them a vision. But remember, there is no Peace Corps anymore. There is no VISTA. We have no subsidy of what is capitalism. How do we educate these kids? We have a military presence. The military presence doesn't work, right? What we've proven is the military presence that we're presenting everywhere doesn't work. So what's happening in the Middle East is decades and decades and decades of tribal disputes and warfare, intervened by the unquenchable thirst of the West to strip them of their resources. And now we leave them as a mistress in chaos. It's not a very good story.
No, it's not. And it's one that we could talk about from now until midnight. We are almost 10 minutes over time. We have no time for questions. I think if anyone would like to ask Tom, you might stick around for a minute or two afterwards about some of his comments and theories. Please feel free to do so. But Tom Barrack, thank you very, very much.